Joined also by at least 20 people live streaming, watching this, which is awesome. So very happy to have that option. This is Emma Gloss. We're very happy to have her here today. She's a staff psychologist. She's with Drexel's Counseling Center, and she is here to talk to us about support and empowerment, recognizing students in crisis. Very timely topic for us. Emma, thank you very much. Take it away.
Thank you so much. Welcome, everyone. It's so nice for all of you to be here. It's like really awesome turnout, so I appreciate your time. And welcome to the people live streaming from the interwebs. Yeah, I guess I don't know where to look when I talk to those people. So I'm really excited to be here for the chance to talk about this issue. I'm sure that we both work with a lot of similar students. I know we're referring students to speak with their advisors. I'm sure that you've all have instances where maybe you have referred a student to the counseling center or wondered about whether you should, or just been concerned about if a student needed extra support. So I think it's really great for us to have a chance to connect and to have this discussion. So one of the reasons why it's important that as a university we're having this discussion is because of the significant increase that we're seeing of students that are dealing with difficulties around their mental health. Right, so this is data from college counseling centers across the country. That 30% increase in students utilizing college counseling services was from just the year 2009 to the year 2015. And since then, it's only increased more and at a greater rate as well. So this is something that universities are noticing sort of across the board. And there's a breakdown up here of the kind of primary issues that students are coming into counseling centers with. And again, this is across the country, but also our counseling center here closely maps onto this data too. So kind of anxiety and depression being the most common things that we see students coming in with concerns about, followed by like relationship issues, family issues, academic issues. Related to that, just anecdotally, I feel like I've been noticing a dramatic increase in like difficulty focusing. I'm curious, just either shouting out or head nods, how much this kind of reflects some things that you've noticed in the students you work with. Okay, I see a lot of head nods. Okay, so there's a couple of things that I'd like to focus on today. And so I think we have an hour and a half scheduled out. And I don't know that is that right?
Yes, 2:30.
Until 2:30. So I don't know that we'll need all that time, but I wanted to leave plenty of time for Q&A and discussion at the end. But I'd also love for this to be conversational. If you have any questions, feel free to shoot a hand up so that we can like have a discussion around this. It seems to me that like faculty and staff at universities are particularly interested in related to this issue is kind of recognizing when students are in distress, and also kind of what do I do if a student is experiencing a crisis? If a student that I'm meeting with is going through a crisis, kind of what do I do? What's the protocol? So we're definitely going to talk about that and focus on that and help you feel more prepared for those kinds of situations. Also, part of the focus of today is kind of talking about recognizing the differences between students that are maybe upset, they're experiencing some distress or stress, but they're actually coping in a fairly healthy or normal adaptive way. And how to recognize those students so that we can empower them and focus on their strengths and encourage them in what they're doing. And how to notice the difference between a student that maybe needs more support than that, right? Part of the reason why this is a focus is there's a conversation also occurring across universities on this term resiliency, right? And how to help students build resilience. So there's some trends across the country of noticing that college students are having a more difficult time coping with everyday stresses, right? So if we circle back to that statistic I showed of that increase in students seeking mental health services. Let's talk about that number for a little bit. Let me go back to it. So some of that number is for good reason. Some of that is because there's a decrease in mental health stigma. There's more of an openness for talking about emotions, talking about issues around mental health, for seeking out therapy. Also, we can hope that this is a reflection that universities are getting better at recognizing students in distress and encouraging them to seek out services. So, good positive things that can be involved in that number. Also, a portion of it is that there seems to be an increase in students experiencing sort of diagnosable mental health issues. And also, some of it seems to be that some students are having a harder time coping with daily stressors. So just head nods. Does that make sense with your experience with the students that you see? Yeah, okay. So universities across the country are having conversations around this idea of resiliency and how can we sort of encourage and foster a culture of resilience in our students, right? And so part of this is why it's important to have this conversation around recognizing the difference between students that are maybe experiencing some stress, experiencing something difficult, and coping fairly well, or maybe just need a little bit more support in how they're coping, and students that need sort of higher levels of support. Because what we want to do is striking this balance between empowering students and their strengths when that's sufficient and connecting them with higher levels of support when that's what they need. And so I think we've come a long way in sort of connecting students with support, and we want to continue that and get better at that. And we also don't want to be so heavy-handed in that we unintentionally send a message to students that they can't handle this on their own, or they don't have the strengths or the skills needed to get through a difficult situation, right? So how do we kind of find that balance? Does that make sense? So this is some of the outcomes that research has connected with resilience, right? So an increased capacity for resilience has been connected with better ability to cope with stressors, better ability to adapt to the transition of college, higher self-esteem, additional other adaptive behaviors, regardless of the level of stress that students experience. So the thing to kind of keep in mind with resilience is that the definition of the term resilience is about adaptively responding to stressors, right? To go through something difficult, to come out the other end feeling like you've learned and you've grown. So when you think about it that way, resilience is tied to growth, and growth is tied to challenge. right? And so you need to experience and you need to go through some challenges on your own to build this quality of resiliency. Okay, so how do we go about promoting resiliency? When is that enough, and when does the student need more support? So that'll be kind of, that'll be the arc of today in our discussion. So starting with how do you go about promoting resiliency, it all has to start with contact with the student, right? So, and thinking about this, I was thinking, well, it seems to me that there's one of two ways that contact can begin with a student. Either you're reaching out to them or they're reaching out to you. I'm assuming that potentially in your role as advisors, most of your contact is through appointments that students make with you. Is that right? Okay. And so the other piece of it is, when does it come on your radar that the student is experiencing something difficult? And it seems to me that similarly, that might involve either a student just disclosing that to you, kind of being direct or upfront, talking to you about what they're going through. Or perhaps another scenario is you're noticing something that causes you to sort of to ask a student or to bring up that conversation. Does that sound right? Sort of one of those two scenarios. So I'm curious, in the situations where you might ask the student, that you might bring up to the student that you're concerned, or you're just wanting to check in on how they're doing. I'm curious, like, what kinds of things is it that you notice that would cause you to maybe have that conversation or to ask a student? Like, what kinds of things do you see? What kinds of things kind of show up on your radar as causing concern, or like, signifying when you would want to talk to a student? Yeah.
Let's say like a drastic change in appearance, like weight loss.
Okay, drastic change in appearance, weight loss. Sure. Other ideas? Yep.
If they don't seem like themselves.
They just don't see like themselves.
You know them and they're normally one way, and then they aren't really responding to the question the same way.
Sure, something seems different than how you've usually known them to be. Other thoughts? Yeah.
Sudden drop in grades.
Sudden drop in grades, sure. Others? Yeah.
Like not attending courses.
Okay, missing classes.
Change in their employment status.
Change in employment status, right, around co-op, sure. Any other ideas? Yeah.
They might be missing scheduled appointments.
Missing scheduled appointments, okay. They're missing things, their responsibilities are dropping off, there's some kind of a drastic change that you notice. So here's a chart of signs of distress, right? And it's separated into academic, physical indicators, psychological indicators, risk indicators. So I don't want you to get overwhelmed with everything on this chart, right? There's a whole lot of information. I don't want you to feel concerned that you have to memorize all of these signs and be able to recognize one when you see it. Mostly because a lot of these things would just occur as bizarre to you or concerning, just sort of via common sense, right? Garbled, tangential, slurred speech, right? That's going to show up on your radar. Delusions, repeated absences, as you mentioned, right? A lot of these things would show up on anybody's radar naturally. Also, I think the most important thing to be on the lookout for, which I already have heard pretty much you all mention, as you mentioned things, the common theme there is a shift, right? There's some kind of a noticeable change that I'm noticing, right? There's some change in behavior or their appearance or their personality. And that's really going to be an important cue to just find out more information, right? Not because it necessarily means that the person's experiencing a mental health diagnosis or that they're experiencing a crisis, but just because it's a good reason to check in and to have a conversation and to see what's going on, right? So I think sometimes, I'm not sure if any of you relate to this, it might differ from person to person, but I think sometimes there can be a little bit of hesitancy or fear of initiating a conversation and looking for more information, because there can be a feeling of sort of, well, what if I come into a bunch of information and now I'm responsible, right? Or kind of like, what do I do from there? What if I don't know how to help the student from there? Or like now I've opened myself up to this like responsibility, right? It's a really understandable kind of concern to have. And hopefully by the time we finish up today, my hope is that you would feel more comfortable having these conversations, because you would feel more prepared about kind of where to take it and kind of how you can respond in a different kind of situation, depending on what the student is bringing up. But that you would feel empowered to have these conversations, because one, information is power. The more you know, the more helpful you can be. Ultimately, it's never going to be your responsibility to solve the student's problems, I guess outside of advising, advising responsibilities, right? But what you can do is help connect them to what would be helpful, right? And also why, I think it's important that you all feel empowered to have these conversations is because you're meeting with the students. They might feel more comfortable talking to you about some things than they feel kind of making an appointment at the counseling center. You might see them more consistently to be able to notice some differences, or you're seeing trends across classes maybe, whereas maybe, like one professor just notices how they're acting in their class, or they haven't seen them over a long period of time. So I think that you're in a position to kind of notice some things and to help a student get support in a unique way. So I'm curious, in your experience, when you have had students that are struggling with particular issues around mental health, does anybody feel comfortable sharing some examples of like the kinds of issues that you see, if there's any themes in what students struggle with? Yeah.
I've had a few students that have come to talk about like strained family relationships.
Family issues, sure. Mm-hmm.
I'm at Steinbright, and we are always having conversations about juggling responsibilities,
Mm.
time management.
Mm-hmm.
So like, how do I do this on top of this, on top of this?
Mm-hmm. So I'm just overwhelmed by all the things going on, and how do I prioritize? Sure. Oh.
I've had students really convey that they've gone through some breakups.
Breakups,
So
yeah.
but not just that isolated incident, Drexel, the piece of Drexel, and
Yeah.
expectations.
Yeah.
And how they're balancing academics and co-op and everything else that they're engaged in. So I think that was a factor of many.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that that's a common situation for our students. It's very fast paced with the quarter system. If I have one stressor, it happens to land on the week of midterms, then how do I catch up, right? Or how do I sit down and focus when my mind is just completely fixated on my breakup and all the stress related to that, or any other stressor that's significant. Other experiences? Yep. Homesickness, yeah. Particularly, I think, for incoming freshmen or for international students.
This is my first time working with international students, and I have heard a lot of them say that this is the first time they've been so far from home.
Yeah.
It may be their first time in a foreign country, but back in Red's life, I had students that were having a hard time adjusting to not living with their families or siblings anymore.
Absolutely. And the competing stressors sometimes of I miss my family, I'm feeling kind of like lonely and homesick, and also I can't get away from my roommate. Like I don't have any space that's my own. I don't have any place to go to just be sad sometimes, right? Did I see another hand in it? Yeah.
I've had a couple students who said that they're dealing with a lot of anxiety, and some of them are getting treated even outside of Drexel.
Anxiety, right? That was one of those top, I think that was the top concern that we see, right? You have your hand up?
Just finances as well.
And financial stress, yeah, absolutely. Okay, let's see how I did. I took some guesses. Relationship issues, family conflict, academics, anxiety, put up substance use, depression, so I think there's some overlap, and of course additional things that we see students struggle with. So when you're working with a student that is talking to you about these issues, anybody feel brave enough to share kind of how that can make you feel in the moment, sitting with students that are talking about some of these things? Yeah.
Worried that I'm going to say the wrong thing.
Worried. Pressure to know what to say. Yeah. Yeah.
Emotional at times.
Emotional. Yeah. Sad, compassionate. I have empathy for that. Yeah.
Concerned that I'm not reading how serious something might be.
And by missing something, right? Afraid that I might miss something, or I might assess the situation wrong. Sure. Yeah.
Concerned that if I'm referring them to the counseling center, they'll feel like I'm pushing them off or pushing them to another resource, like I'm not.
Sure. Or if I do really try to take what they're saying seriously and I give them a referral to speak with somebody, if they feel like they're going to be passed along, or if they're maybe going to have a feeling of like, oh, wow, you really think I'm messed up, right? Yeah.
I've had students get emotional in front of me just by talking to them, and then they shut down. And then what's the next step to try to get them to kind of open up, or to
Sure.
know if they need a referral? Like,
Sure, kind of like, what do I do if I can't even get more information, right? I don't even know where to go. I don't have more information to know what the right thing to do is. Sure. So, let's see, I took some guesses again. So in terms of how all these conversations can make you feel in the moment, right? Being in the room, speaking with somebody going through something difficult brings up emotions in us, right? We're always feeding off of each other's energies, our psychological cues, right? And so that's one of the tough things is that, then we have our own emotions in the moment. So I heard some of this fear, right? Compassion, sadness, maybe stress. I didn't necessarily hear it, but frustration or anger can be understandable too. Maybe it's a student that kind of is making a lot of appointments and maybe not taking responsibility, or it doesn't feel that way, right? Like it's natural to feel frustrated sometimes too. And then I'm curious, thinking about these different emotions, when you feel them in the moment, how can those feelings then pull you to want to respond or react? So like, when I feel afraid that I'm maybe misunderstanding the situation or not referring the student to the right support, sort of when you feel that feeling, how are you likely to kind of like follow up or act with the student? Yeah.
Let me be a little more reserved.
Okay.
Somebody was saying you don't want to say the wrong thing. So
Right. So if I feel afraid about saying the wrong thing, then I might have some like restraint. I might be like a little bit quieter, more reserved with the student. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
I think if you're afraid, it can become the focal point of the appointment. It's, as an academic advisor, yes, you need to focus on these things, but
Yeah.
also after a certain point, after making referrals, there's usually the academic piece that you have to
Sure,
get on?
sure. So if I feel afraid, I might be inclined to really kind of focus a lot of my attention and energy towards this issue when there's really other things that I'm here to help the student with. And maybe they're really here for those other things too, but I'm distracted by some fear, right? Any other thoughts? Yeah.
By having that fear, sometimes you forget to be in the moment with the student because you're automatically thinking about, okay, how can I solve this?
Yeah.
Quickly, then you forget to actually be in the room with
Yeah.
the student, listening to what they're saying because you're just thinking about how am I going to reply, what's going to be.
Absolutely. So with any sort of intense internal experience, it makes it harder for us to kind of like be present, right? It becomes a bit of a distraction, especially fear if we're starting to think through like, what do I do? What do I say? Where do I send them? How do I help? Right? And then it's harder to stay in the moment, and it can be easy to miss kind of actually what the student is sharing. So you guys are wonderful, by the way. Thank you so much for all of your ideas. So again, I took some more guesses that, around how some of these feelings can then lead to, reacting or responding to a student in a certain way, right? Maybe, and this could differ from person to person depending on the feeling. Maybe for me, when I feel afraid, I'm more likely to kind of like shut down or withdraw or end the appointment quickly because I don't want the responsibility, I don't want to find out more information, right? For somebody else, if I feel afraid, I might focus more on that, try to get as much information as I can and kind of take responsibility, right? So like taking a parental role, trying to solve the problem for the student, especially if I'm feeling compassionate. I want to help fix this, right? So when thinking about helping students work through challenges, or just being there for students that are going through something difficult, one of the tough things is that all of those issues that we talked about that students come in with, the relationship issues, the anxiety, the family concerns, many of these issues we're not going to be able to solve for the students, and that's hard to sit with. That can be hard to kind of manage for us in the moment, right? But that's okay, especially when we're considering that what we want to be, an important part of what we want to be doing for our students is building that resiliency and empowering them that they have the tools at their disposal to kind of work through challenges, right? So remembering that actually by not always solving a problem for a student, by being supportive, but realizing that, this is the student's challenge to work through on their own, we're giving them all of these opportunities, right? We're giving them, empowering them in the chance to do their own problem solving, to get the gratification that comes through, like thinking through what they really want and how they want to go about solving the issue, giving them the opportunity to experience their discomfort and then learn the lesson that they can tolerate that discomfort, that they actually have what it takes to kind of get through that, and all the growth that comes from that, right? So that being said, what can we do in these situations? So as we were talking about all the ways that a student's emotions, how a student kind of shows up in our interaction with them can affect us and can affect how we feel, we too can have a big impact on how that student feels just by the kind of energy that we're able to like display and like model for them, right? So as humans, we're always kind of looking to others to inform like how we should feel in the moment, right? If I was looking out at all of you and your eyes were darting around and you were looking at the exits, I would be like, oh, what's going on? Like, right? What am I missing, right? And I would get worried, right? So we look to other people to inform sort of how we should be feeling. And so a big first step of what we can offer students is just being able to model for them calmness and confidence that they can get through whatever they're struggling with, right? And we can do that, and we're going to kind of talk about how to do that in a way that still validates and acknowledges what they're going through, right? So it's not minimizing their concern. It's not being dismissive of how they're feeling. It's completely empathizing in a way that is also calm and confident that they can get through this. So how do we go about doing that, right? So the first step is, as I was saying, checking in with our own experience, right? What's coming up for us in the moment? And then kind of checking in with what's your intention for the moment. Is it to hear the student? Is it to accomplish a specific task in terms of your advising, in terms of your appointment? Is it just to hear them and to be able to offer them some options or help them come up with the next best step? So in terms of noticing our own reactions and being able to model sort of that calm, confident, resilient stance, that brings me to this concept of mindfulness. So can you raise your hand if you've come across this term mindfulness before? Okay, lots of hands raised. So I'm assuming that maybe it seems like almost everybody's familiar with the term. Maybe you have different experiences of like how familiar you are with it. Like I've heard of it, I don't really know what it's about. Or like maybe I love it, I do it every day. Is that fair? It's kind of a spectrum. So for those of you that maybe you've heard this term, but maybe don't feel as familiar about what it means, basically, like the simplest definition of mindfulness is awareness of the present moment. And that can mean kind of awareness of your surroundings in the present moment. And it also means awareness of what's happening internally in the present moment. So what's going on with my own thoughts and my own feelings in the present moment. And there's different ways that you can practice mindfulness and you can cultivate an ability to kind of be aware of the present moment. Right, it can be anything from sort of like formal as sitting down with my legs crossed in the Om position and meditating for an hour. Or it can be less formal, just as I go about my day, I kind of check in with where I'm at and what's going on in the moment. So like one of my favorite examples of what the difference of mindfulness is like when I'm getting ready in the morning and I'm taking my shower, instead of, am I thinking about kind of the meeting that I have later, the presentation, how prepared am I, what I have planned this weekend and I can't wait to get there, or I'm ruminating about a conversation from the day before, my husband bothered me and I'm going over the conversation and what I should have said was this, whatever. Right? My mind is everywhere but where I'm actually at in that moment. The difference is mindfulness might be, I'm really noticing kind of how the water feels on my skin and the smells of that moment, the sound of the water trickling. Maybe when my mind starts to wander, I notice that that's what's happening in the moment. That's my internal present experience, right? And I notice that when my mind wanders to that thought about something later today, how it creates a feeling in my body, right? Does that make sense? Okay. How many of you, raise your hand, have practiced some mindfulness before? Okay, so still a lot of hands. So in case any of you haven't, or just for the sake of a little mid-afternoon mindfulness break, I thought I would walk you all through a quick, very basic mindfulness meditation. Would you guys be up for taking just a few minutes to do that? Cool. Okay. So what I'm going to ask you to do is I'll walk you through it as we do it, but the gist of it is I'm going to ask you to focus on your breath. And by focus on your breath, I mean really keep all your attention on your breath. And the reason why we do that is because you always have your breath. You should always have it, otherwise we have bigger problems, right? So it's just a focal point that's always with you. And what happens is, as soon as we try to keep our attention one place, our mind is going to wander all different sorts of places. And so the exercise, the meditation, is simply just noticing when your mind wanders and redirecting it back to your breath, right? So let's do it together in a comfortable position, and I encourage you to gently close your eyes. I think it makes it a little bit easier. And I always like to start off with a few deep breaths. So go ahead and take a deep breath in. Slowly exhale. Deep breath in. Slowly exhale. One last deep breath in. And as you slowly exhale, notice if there's any tension in your body, you can just kind of release. Then you can return your breath back to its normal breathing rhythm. No kind of fancy breathing, just whatever feels natural. And I just want you to gently bring your attention to your experience of the breath. Something we do all day, every day. It's pretty rare that we just take a moment and really focus on what it feels like to be breathing. For some people, it's helpful to focus on a specific place where you notice the breath. So maybe that's the air flowing in and out of your nostrils, or the feeling of your chest rising and falling. And what you might already be noticing is that as you try to keep your awareness on your breath, your mind starts to distract you with all different kinds of thoughts. Your mind might pull you to thoughts about the future, things to come, things that have already happened. Your mind might bring up all different kinds of judgmental thoughts, thoughts about this exercise, about your ability to do the exercise. So all of that is fine. That's exactly what our minds do. They constantly churn out different thoughts for us. But for this moment, I want you to just notice when your mind wanders and gently redirect it back to focusing on the breath. And this will continue to happen again and again. You'll notice that your mind wandered. And you just take note of where it wandered to and gently bring your attention back to your breath. And let's finish up and just take one more deeper than normal breath in. Slowly exhale, and you can gently open your eyes. How'd that feel for folks? Anybody care to share what they noticed as they tried that? So you noticed your mind brought you to thoughts of the past?
Yes.
So good job noticing what your mind was doing. I saw a hand back there.
It was very calming.
You felt calmer? Good. You're welcome. Any other reactions? Anybody not feel calm? Felt frustrated or yes?
I often struggle with, well, what am I supposed to be thinking about?
Uh,
Kind of go off on that. So.
As long as you're noticing that thought and you're trying to bring yourself back to the breath, you're doing it. Right, so that's a common misconception that a meditation is supposed to feel relaxing. It's nice when it does. Sometimes it does. But not necessarily. Really, the meditation is just taking a moment to notice what's happening inside, what's happening in my mind, what's happening in my body. There's a lot going on in there. It doesn't always feel relaxing. It can feel like a little overwhelming to check in with. But that's fine. The effectiveness of it is that you're taking that moment to check in. And also, by noticing when your mind wanders and choosing to redirect it back to your breath, not only are you, over time, if you practice this routinely, getting better at noticing sort of what's going on internally, but also getting a little bit better at redirecting your attention when you want to. So, how can we apply this with the work that we do with students? So mindful listening is the same sorts of concepts applied to being present to listening to another person. So, a show of hands, how many of you can relate to having a conversation, or maybe being in a meeting, maybe being in this presentation, and suddenly realizing that you have no idea what's been talked about, and you don't know for how long that you haven't noticed what's been talked about? Yeah, okay, so I didn't see raise of hands, but I'll take the giggles as confirmation. So mindful listening is, right, applying that same concept of noticing what's happening for you internally and being able to redirect when you want to redirect to where you'd like your attention to be. So when working with students, this might be sort of applying this ability to notice when a student is sharing, what is that bringing up for me inside? Is that causing fear? Is that making me think about kind of what do I need to do next? Am I feeling frustrated? Is that making me want to just end the session? Right? Noticing all those things internally, and because you're noticing them as they're happening, being able to choose, okay, I'm going to refocus on just really taking in what this person is sharing, right? And when something else happens inside that distracts me, I refocus and really pay attention to what this person is sharing. Does that make sense? Right? So the first step in being able to kind of really fully understand a student's issue, and also buying yourself the time to get all the information and decide sort of how you want to go from there. So once we have the ability to kind of be present with the student and understand what's going on for them, then it becomes a matter of understanding the problem. So we talked about a lot of different issues that students bring up. I wanted to focus a little bit on these ones specifically because I think that these are things that are the tougher ones to differentiate from each other. Does that fit your experience? Right? So what's the difference between stress? What's the difference between anxiety? When is the student in crisis? Right? So we're going to go a little bit deeper into the differences between those. Ooh, I shouldn't have jumped ahead. Any guesses? I gave you some help about what some of the differences are between stress, anxiety, and a crisis. Guys, come on. I gave you help.
I feel like anxiety is more of like a hijacking of your thoughts, which begins to have physical manifestations like tightness in your chest,
Okay.
sickness.
So hijacking of thoughts that then has some like physical symptoms, right? So it's like I really lost control of my thoughts and then it's coming up in my body. Okay, any other ideas? Ooh, I see lots of hands. Okay, I saw a hand back there first.
So I think of stress as like a natural emotional and physiological response to thoughts, things that are happening,
Stuff,
whatever.
yeah.
And then they can be hijacked and then
Okay. Okay. Other thoughts? Yeah.
I think about stress is what's going on around me right now is really difficult, and I'm dealing with that. But anxiety is more what's going to happen in the future is really difficult, and that's getting to me right this time.
Okay, so anxiety is a little bit more sort of future focus, what's going to happen. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And I think the big question between the three as well is how much is it impeding their ability to like do what they need to do today?
Sure. How much is it affecting functioning?
Yeah.
So really good ideas, and I think all of which are relevant to kind of thinking through what the differences are. So let's talk about it. So when we think about stress, I'm just going to jump right ahead. So when we think about stress, we think about it in terms of sort of a natural response to a situation in which the perceived demands on you are perceived to exceed your resources for meeting those demands. Right? So that's kind of a jargony way to say there's too much on your plate, right? And stress is, when I say like a natural reaction, stress is like an adaptive reaction when we have more going on than we can cope with, right? So like sometimes I have students come to me saying they're suffering from anxiety, and when I ask them about what's going on, they talk to me about, well, you know, I'm working a full-time job and I'm also a full-time student, and also I'm involved in this sorority, and we have to go to all these meetings, and if I don't go there, then I get kicked out, and then I'm also part of this organization, and I'm trying to make it to all of those, and when I'm doing all of this, I don't ever have time to go out with any of my friends, to have any time to myself. And I'm like, yeah, of course you're feeling the way that you're feeling. That's your body's way of telling you there's too much going on, right? So we can think about stress as more situational, more a reaction. I think as somebody was saying, as to the sort of what's going on situationally for the person. Anxiety tends to be more chronic, kind of more consistent regardless of the situation, though it can go up or down depending on the amount of stress, right? So this is where it gets tricky to kind of parse out, because anxiety can stress can increase anxiety. And what also makes it difficult to parse out is that a lot of the symptoms are very much the same. So both stress and anxiety can cause those physical symptoms of heart racing, can cause worried thoughts, can cause tension. So we think about anxiety as kind of like an excessive response to a situation. Sort of like the reaction, the impact it's having does not match the sort of situational demands or stressors. It also doesn't necessarily fade after the situation has resolved, right? So it kind of sticks around. A lot of times somebody with anxiety has some awareness that the way they're feeling it or the way they're reacting doesn't quite match the situation. And that can even cause some more difficult feelings. That can sometimes cause some like shame or frustration with oneself, right? Is that helpful, kind of that difference between anxiety and stress a little bit, right? Again, acknowledge sometimes it can be tough to parse out. Sometimes it's tough for us to parse out because sometimes it's a little bit of both. So crisis, now when I talk about crisis, I'm using this term from sort of perspective as a psychologist. And we have a very particular definition of crisis, that this is a situation in which there's a threat of harm, or there's a serious risk of danger to the student or to others, or potentially there very recently was a very dangerous situation, right? So crisis is more a situation that sort of requires some immediate intervention. Does that make sense? Okay. So what I wanted to come up with was a little bit of a flow chart for kind of orienting around, given the situation, how do I support the student, right? Getting back to that kind of recognizing when a student might need more support and what that support might be. So we start with, when do I reinforce resiliency, right? So when a student is upset but managing, so write this column to the left. When a student is upset but managing, what might that student look like? They might be emotional, right? Something to remember is that things like crying are sometimes a really appropriate response to some situations, and not necessarily indicative that the student is experiencing a crisis or needs further support. That might be their way of coping, right? So a student might look very upset, might be emotional, but some things that you can look for are they able to engage in problem solving? Though they are upset, are they able to kind of think through the situation, think through options, kind of engage in planning? Are they future-oriented, right? They're still kind of thinking about, what do I do next? Where do I go from here? And they're able to identify their supports. They can think about sort of what are the other people or places or things they can go to help, right? I can think ahead. I can think, I'm really upset right now about this right now. I think I'm going to go back to my room. I'm going to talk about my roommate. They're really supportive around things like this. Or I'm going to give my mom a call and let her know what's going on. When a student is upset and struggling, right? So what are some of the indicators that, student's upset and they really need some extra support? So in some ways, it's a little bit of the inverse, right? They're upset and they're too emotional to be able to engage in some problem solving. They're having trouble kind of organizing their thoughts, thinking of options, thinking about what they could do next, identifying supports. Also, if you see that a student is struggling in more than one area, right? I would imagine that you might deal with students upset because maybe they failed a particular class, or something is kind of going on, one specific situation they're having challenges with. But if you're noticing that there's some difficulties that are spanning across situations or just several areas of life, they're experiencing challenges at the same time, that's a good indicator that they might need a little bit more support, right? And then how do you know when a student is in crisis? We'll go through some of the indicators, but ultimately, at the end of the day, the best way that you can know is to ask. And that can feel uncomfortable sometimes. It gets more comfortable the more you do it. Trust me, I do it every day. Generally, if it seems like a student is kind of over here, it doesn't hurt to ask. Are they having any thoughts about suicide? Are they having thoughts about harming themselves, right? Some good indicators is if you hear some signs of hopelessness. So the student starts saying things like, this will never work out, my life is over, there's no solution to this. It'd be better off if I was gone. If you notice them acting sort of increasingly agitated, of course, if you're starting to feel concerned about your safety, of course, right? These are indicators of potential crisis. At the end of the day, you want to be asking. So we'll continue to talk about that a little bit more, but let's kind of circle back through kind of what's your plan of action for each of these scenarios. So a student is upset, but they're managing. That's the student we want to reinforce resiliency with, right? We want to empower them. They've got this. They have a lot of strengths that they've already shown. You can first model that distress tolerance, right? So you kind of checking in with yourself and noticing your energy and kind of modeling that calm and confident stance. Showing empathy, right? This will help with everything to come after. This will help with all the problem solving. This will help with kind of planning to first just acknowledge and really empathize. I can see that this is a really tough situation. I completely understand why this is distressing for you. Highlighting their strengths. So looking for the things that you can already give the student some credit for. An easy one is the fact that they're sitting there with you. They've already talked about this. I would imagine that the work that you do with students, you can have some things to draw from that you know of them. You know, even the fact that they're here at Drexel, a challenging university with a fast pace. So looking for the things that you can really kind of highlight. And then going into problem solving / what I like to focus on even more than problem solving is developing a plan, right? So let me catch up with myself. Okay, so the reason why I like to encourage people to think more about developing a plan with the student than problem solving, because as we talked about, not all of these problems are going to be solvable, and that's a lot of pressure to put on yourself, right? That's where you can start to feel responsible for coming up with solutions. And sometimes there's just not an immediate solution to what the student is going through. It's not going to be solved in that moment or in that day. So what can be helpful is helping the student walk through kind of somewhat of a plan. And sometimes that plan can even just be, okay, let's just figure out what's the next best step, right? What's one helpful thing that you can do from here? So some things that can be helpful is just helping them sort through sort of, okay, what are the knowns of the situation and what are the unknowns? Are there any assumptions that you're drawing right now that maybe we need to find out more information about? Once you identify what the unknowns of the situation are, that can really help lead into figuring out what's the next step. Because sometimes the next step is just finding more information, right? I would imagine potentially, oftentimes you as the advisor might be providing some of that information, and then there might be some things that the student has to follow up to find out more, right? Sometimes the more information can be, okay, you have this information, and now the missing piece is for you to sit with this for a bit and decide what feels the best for you, right? And that's the missing piece. I'm just not sure yet. Well, there's a lot going on. We talked about a lot today. Why don't you just take some time to kind of sit with it and process it? And then also sometimes a helpful next step is, who can help you do this? Is there anybody else that would be helpful to talk to about it, right? This is also helpful for you in terms of giving yourself a bit of an out for taking on more responsibility than you need to in your role, right? At the end of the day, you are not counselors and you're not the student's friends. You have a specific role. And so how can you balance that being supportive and also maintaining the boundaries of your role? And that's a nice way to do it, just helping the student think through, okay, who would be good to reach out to from here? So kind of finishing up with directing the student to help remind them, help them think through what their natural supports are. So when we say natural supports, we're talking about the resources the student already has embedded in their life. Sometimes when you're going through a stressful situation, it's really hard to think up and to realize kind of all the things that are helpful for you. So even just having like a little bit of help, floating some suggestions by, can help a student remember, okay, I have people I can talk to about this. I have places I can go. I can get support with this, right? And also, again, helping you as the advisor not feeling like you're the sole responsibility for helping the student through this, right? How many of you know about the peer counseling helpline? Okay, just a few hands. So the counseling, one of the things that the Counseling Center does is we have a group of other Drexel students, and we give them training on being supportive listeners. And the number for the peer counseling helpline is on our Drexel website. These are for sort of non-crisis situations where the student just needs somebody else to talk through and they feel like they don't know who to go to. This is a really good resource to have in your back pocket. It's not 24/7, it's open. I think most weeknights during specific times, usually in the evening, because that's when students tend to feel stress and call the most. So all that information is on our website. So it's a handy one to keep in mind. The number?
Yeah.
Me write it on the board?
Yeah, I have it right here.
Oh, yeah, that would be, yeah. Is this a board I can write on? Okay. Yeah, if I can find an expo. Oh, I found one.
215-895-1523.
Thank you. There you go. Monday through Thursday, 8 p.m. to midnight. Thank you. Okay, so and also part of, helping a student remember and to think about their natural supports, right, is also helping them kind of think through their coping skills, right? Or what are the things that kind of help make you feel better? I think a helpful way to frame this with students is acknowledging that none of these things are necessarily going to solve the problem, right? That can actually be a very validating thing to say because it's acknowledging that what the student is going through is difficult and it's not going to necessarily be easily solved. So a way that I like to frame this is just kind of acknowledging, it sounds like this is a stressful situation. I'm sure that it'll continue to be difficult for a little bit. So maybe we can just think about what are some things that you can do to make this time a little bit easier for yourself, right? To be kind to yourself and to do something that tends to make you feel a little bit better. So that's how I like to frame that, and then helping them think through kind of what those things are for them. Some things to be on the lookout for. The fix-it reflex, right? So I think we talked about this somewhat.
Someone online asked,
oh,
peer
hi.
counselors both undergraduate and graduate level?
I believe they can be undergraduate or graduate students. I know that there are mostly undergraduate students, and it's anonymous both ways. So the students that call are not asked for any identifying information, and peer counselors are trained to not give out any identifying information. So the caller wouldn't even necessarily know if they're speaking to an undergrad or graduate student. And those peer counselors are also trained in not just being empathic listeners, but also kind of Drexel resources and supports too. So yeah, thanks for that question. I didn't know that was a thing. Thanks live streaming people. Right, so we already kind of talked about this like fix-it reflex kind of taking on responsibility for solving the problem, something to be aware of and on the lookout for in yourself. The tough love too, right? Remembering that like empowering, promoting resiliency is not the same as kind of dismissing a student's concerns, right? There is a way to do it in a very empathic, validating way and still kind of acknowledging that the student has what it takes to get through this situation, and you're here to help them think through that. Does that make sense? Okay, so what do I do when a student is upset and they're struggling? They need more than just their own coping skills. They need some extra support, right? So how do I go about referring to the counseling center? Before somebody mentioned some of the fear that can come up with making that referral. How's the student going to respond to making that referral? Is there another question?
Another question is the peer counseling available for online students?
I believe so. Yeah, I believe so. I can double check about that with our staff that supervises, and if that's not true, then I can get that information out. Okay, so how to make a referral to the counseling center. As I said, I know that can feel like a little bit intimidating of a thing to do sometimes. I think part of what's helpful is knowing kind of, right, what's the difference between when a student's upset but coping okay on their own and when they could really use some more support. So hopefully that's a little helpful information to orient around this. I think another helpful thing to keep in mind is that oftentimes a referral to the counseling center can feel like a really validating thing. It can be like, okay, you're seeing that I am struggling with this, right? And you want to make sure that I'm connecting with the people that can help me. And in terms of fears about, will it feel like I'm just kind of passing them along to the next person? I think sometimes a helpful way to frame that, to mitigate that risk, is, again, just validating and then just acknowledging, I want to make sure that you get the support that'll be helpful, and I'm here, but I'm also not an expert with these things, and I wouldn't want to not give you information about the people that can particularly help you with this, right? And then it's just informing them, giving them the information, right? So we're talking about this kind of scenario where it's not a crisis scenario. A crisis scenario is the only time that you really need to make sure that student is connected with us or with some higher level of support. In this scenario, and this is, this can be tough, is that all you can really do is give the student the information and encourage them, and then it's in their hands. The students might decide they're not comfortable reaching out, they might not follow up, they might find other ways of managing the situation. Counseling is not necessarily for everybody, and at the end of the day, it's outside of our control. The student gets to take that information and decide what they do with it. Maybe they don't follow through and realize they should have, and the next time something comes up, they're more willing. Yeah?
If we put counseling center as a referral when we're putting our international ABT, do you reach out to them, or is it just?
No. So I don't know what that is, but I'm pretty confident. I'm pretty confident the answer is no. So it's okay, so maybe that's a question we can circle back to because it's related to kind of handling a student in crisis. And so I'm going to try to weave that in. And then if I'm not addressing that, if you could remind me and kind of bring it back up, that would be wonderful. Any other questions about this in terms of referring? Yeah.
I just wanted to say, I try to really destigmatize the whole counseling thing because I think a lot of students still, it's like, oh my God, going to the counseling
Yeah.
center, I can't handle it. I always try to tell them that I think most people should go to therapy, and that usually gives maybe a little bit of a chuckle from them. And then I also try to remind them this is like someone who is not like in your circle, who like, is not has any bias to you and is just really looking out for your best interest. And I think that sort of helps them to realize a little bit more that maybe it's something beneficial for them.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you so much for bringing that up. And for those of you online, what she was saying was destigmatizing going to therapy. And sometimes I think what can be really helpful about making a referral is just, when I say providing information, not just about sort of like, here's the number that you call or here's where the office is, also like providing as much information as you can about what it might be like when you go into therapy, what you can expect. Even saying things like, I've met the therapist there. This girl Emma came by. She seemed cool. Just lie like that, right? So So kind of demystifying it, right? And so if it's helpful for you, the way that appointments usually work, a student can either walk in and schedule at the desk in person, or they can give us a call and do it over the phone. If they get a voicemail, then we'll call them back usually within a day. They schedule an initial assessment appointment. They'll sit down with somebody like myself for a shorter appointment, just for us to get an understanding of kind of what's going on for them, what they're feeling challenged by, and then we talk about our resources and the best plan for them moving forward. And so there's also, it's not just individual sessions, individual therapy. We also have workshops, we have group therapy. There's a lot of different options. And they can use that first session as just kind of information gathering. So if it's helpful to kind of share that information and demystify it a little bit too. Okay, and I said I was going to leave all this time for Q&A. Okay, so let's make sure we talk about kind of recognizing and responding to crisis, and then we can have more of a discussion. So again, as I was saying, we think about a crisis. When we use this term, we're talking about when a student presents a serious threat of harm to themselves or to others. Or I don't have up there, but I probably should, if a particular harmful or dangerous situation kind of just happened, right? So like if the student just recently experienced an assault or something like that, right? We want to make sure these are the times in which we need to make sure the student is connected. We want to make sure that they get kind of care right away. So examples could be if they're feeling suicidal, if they're making threats to others, if they're engaging in self-injury. Yeah, question.
So if a student reports like thoughts of self-harm or wanting to end their life, how do I ensure that the student is going to physically get to your office?
So that's exactly what we're going to talk about. So again, just to hit on this point one more time, it can't be said enough. You want to ask. If you're concerned, you want to ask. Sometimes there can be fear of, if I ask, am I going to put the idea in their mind? Am I going to make them think of that? That is not true. It can feel uncomfortable to ask. Maybe it could make them feel uncomfortable that you ask. That's fine. That's a risk we're willing to take to recognize the students that are feeling this way, that are having these thoughts. I encourage you to just get familiar with these words, saying these words out loud. Practice in the mirror. Let your loved ones know what you're doing so that they're not concerned. Practice with each other, just asking the question and just kind of getting the discomfort out of your system of just asking the question, right? Okay, and then what do we do? How do we make sure that the student is connected? So you have a few options. The first one would be, if this is occurring during office hours, you can call the counseling center with the student in the moment. Or you can even walk the student over to the counseling center together. Something to be really mindful of in these kinds of situations that, to my knowledge, your role is not a confidential role. I believe us as therapists are the only resources on the campus that our role is confidential. And so you don't want to put yourself in a situation where you are agreeing to keep secrets, right? And this can be tough. A student says, I don't want you to tell anybody. I don't want anybody else to know. This is a time where you really have to be firm. And you can do it in an empathic way, and you can frame it as such as, at the end of the day, your safety is my absolute priority, and I need to make sure that you get the support that you need, and I have to let somebody know about this, right? And so just saying it directly. So if you find yourself in such a situation, student says they're feeling suicidal, says that they're at risk for harming themselves or others, you let them know. You have to get them connected to support. You have to let somebody know about this information. Then you're in a situation where it's going to go one of two ways. The student's going to be like, okay, they're going to be sort of compliant in that and agreeable to the next steps, or they're not going to be. Chances are 9.99 times out of 10, they're probably going to understand and they're going to feel okay with connecting with the counseling center. In which case, as I said, you can call them over the phone, and if you've got our receptionist, she can, you can explain the situation to her, and she can get a therapist on the line to further assess. So during office hours, the first kind of step would be calling our general number or walking the student over to the counseling center. If you call that number and you don't get the receptionist, if it goes to voicemail, you can call our on-call counselor. I'm going to put this contact information on the next slide. So we have an emergency on-call counselor. It's primarily for after-hours situations. It's one of us, so during the day we're just oftentimes going to be in session. But after hours, there's a therapist on that other line 24/7. During the weekends, that can help assess crisis situations and kind of plan further steps. So you can call the on-call counselor. You can call them with the student there and have them speak with the counselor. You can speak with them with the student there. If the student's not willing to kind of go through this with you, you can call the counselor yourself, the on-call counselor yourself. You can say that you're going to do that and you'd like the student to be there for it, or you can just let them know if they're not willing to be there, you're going to be calling regardless. And if that happens, the more information you can give us, the better. And so don't necessarily feel like just as soon as the student says, I'm having thoughts about suicide, you need to stop there. Again, I know this can feel like a scary situation of, well, if I get all this information, I'm responsible for it. That's really not the case, because you're just going to pass that information along. So then the more we have, the better we are at assessing that situation, especially if the student's not present. So what's tough is like if we get a call and it's like the student was really concerned, it seemed really concerning, and they said that they just don't want to be here anymore. Okay, well, is the student there? No, they're not here at this moment. Then we're kind of in a position of like, well, that could mean a lot of things. Like it's really, we need more information, right? So the more information we have, the better. So that's kind of like your flow chart for these scenarios. You can call our main office, walk the student over, call the on-call counselor. If ever you feel like the threat of danger is like imminent, you need somebody to intervene, you know, in the moment right away, then also you can call DUPD. If we get a student that we assess to be like at imminent risk, that's what we're going to do anyway, right? So if you just know that, you feel free to call DUP as well. Oh, no. I have the contact information on a handout that I printed out for you all. I think I should have enough. I apologize. I thought that I had a slide with it. I think maybe I brought the wrong version. It's also all on our website as well. So if you go to the Counseling Center at Drexel. Thank you. I can also, if those are hard to read, I can also, and I'm happy to provide all of this electronically. I can pass it along and then it can get dispersed as well. I want to be conscientious of time. We have a few minutes left for Q&A. I'm also perfectly happy to hang out a little bit longer and answer any questions, and also want you to feel free to continue with all the other responsibilities of your day as well. So first of all, thank you all so much for being here, for participating. I really appreciate your time. So questions? Yeah.
You mentioned that you need as much information as possible when we call you. So if the student does say, yes, I'm suicidal, I'm having thoughts of suicide, what other information would be useful to you?
So good question. So
Can you just repeat the question for...
Oh, yeah, absolutely. So the question was, I said that more information is helpful. should a student say that they're having thoughts about suicide, what more information is helpful? So some things that I'll be asking a student when they call is, how long have they been having those thoughts? Are they thinking about specific things that they might do to harm themselves? Are they feeling like that's something that they might act on? Or does it just seem like sort of a thought that has been floating around in their mind? Have they ever taken any action towards those thoughts? Right? So some of that is helpful, right? You might find that maybe a student has those thoughts, and maybe they've been dealing with thoughts like that for a very, very long time. Still, absolutely connect the student with us. But that's helpful information for us to have in terms of assessing like what's going on for this student in this moment. Is that helpful?
So those questions that you just posed would be questions that you would want us to ask?
It's fine for you to ask those questions. It's asking those questions with the intent to get that information to us. So all helpful information, right? What to do with that information is our responsibility. And if we can get access to the student, then those are the questions we're going to be asking. But it's helpful for us to know, right? And so the only thing you're responsible for then is getting that information to us. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Okay, yeah.
I just have one more question.
Mm-hmm.
What are your thoughts about disclosing mental health to employers? Because I've had some students who either had to leave their jobs because of some mental health issues, or I had a young man who had searched for a really long time to get a placement and finally got something. And like 1 week he called me really excited, said he was going to come in and bring in his paperwork for me to register his opportunity. So when he came in, I thought that I was going to complete the registration, but you can just tell that he wasn't himself. And he was saying that, I'm not going to be able to move forward. I recently received a diagnosis and I'm not going to be able to continue with work. Now I know stuff like that is a very private matter that you probably don't want to share with a lot of people, but what about when it's interfering with the person continuing their job? Do you think that it's ever appropriate to share with your employer that you're dealing with some mental health issues, and if so, how would you go about that?
So the question was about whether it's appropriate disclosing about mental health issues to an employer. And admittedly, I feel inclined to be like somewhat restrained in my response because in some ways it's a little bit outside of my expertise, because it can depend, in my experience, it can depend a lot on the employer and the specific employment situation. So like, for example, if a student is working in a company where there's an HR department, a lot of times if I see students that are on co-op, and like this is a situation that comes up often, in order to make an appointment with us, they need to be able to leave co-op a little bit early, or maybe like go in a little bit late. And so oftentimes I encourage students to let their employer know, or the person in the HR department know, that they have a regularly scheduled appointment, or to let them know that they have an appointment with a therapist, and so that then they're oftentimes very willing to like work with the student in that situation. But at the end of the day, I can't guarantee how individual employers are going to respond. I would assume that there's policies around, if a student feels like they were unfairly discriminated against because of mental health issues. But in terms of what those policies are, that starts to get a little bit outside of what I feel like really competent in. So, sometimes I might help a student think through sort of how to let an employer know in a way that manages their own privacy. And so in terms of, I had a recent loss, or I'm going through a difficult time, I'm seeking some support, so not getting into too much detail, I think. But it can be pretty situational. Yeah. Yeah, back there.
I think there's a rumor going around for some of my students from the pre-med track. It just seems to be that they're concerned about the confidentiality of a campus counseling center.
Yeah.
They don't what can I say?
Sure. So the question is when a student feels concerned about how confidential is a college counseling center. So we are completely confidential in the way that any other therapist is, and that really the times that we would break confidentiality would be if somebody is a serious threat of harm to themselves or to others. When I talk about that with students from the very first session, I kind of go through that doesn't necessarily mean as soon as you have maybe start to think about like a suicidal thought or a thought of harming yourself that I automatically break your confidentiality. Like we will always talk through it together. And that potential is there when it seems like breaking your confidentiality is absolutely what's necessary for maintaining your safety or the safety of others. And again, that's true for therapists in general. That's the level of confidentiality that they're going to get in any kind of treatment that they're in. And there's some other, situations of, if there's child abuse or if there's court order. Again, same across the board for therapists and in general. Everything else is confidential. Now, we work in the counseling center as a team. And so, right, for example, we have an on-call counselor. Oh, which brings me back to there was a question about, there was a question, yeah, back there about if we reach out to students. Okay, so this is related. Under what circumstances do we reach out to students? It depends on a few things. Generally, we're never going to reach out to a student unless there's good indication of a crisis, right? So we don't reach out to students to just check in if it seems like they're having a hard time, right? Because that is the responsibility that falls into the student's autonomy, So well, those situations where you're giving them the information for the counseling center and then they get to decide what they want to do with that information. So in the same way, a doctor's not going to call you up and be like, I heard you weren't feeling well. I think you should come in, right? We're not going to be reaching out to students in that way unless we get sufficient indication that the student may be in crisis. And then there's a few things that we can do. Now, one, the on-call counselor will be able to access if the student has already been to our counseling center, if they're seeing a therapist, and can relay some information to that therapist. If it seems like there's good indication that there's imminent risk of harm to themselves or others, we can contact DUPD and do like a wellness check on the student to go, especially if they're on campus housing, to check in with them. So there's like a few things that we can do to get in touch with students that we're really concerned like about safety in particular. Does that answer your question? Okay. Yeah.
So your presentation was wonderful. I'm wondering how some of this information can be given to the faculty. Because like as much as we try to see them or they come in, faculty are the ones that really can see if a student is
absolutely
in distress.
So the question was how to get this information to faculty, and the answer is we're working on it. So this same presentation, I have a focus right now on adapting it for different departments in the university and bringing it to different departments. So I met with the athletic coaches and talked to them, right? They're in another position where they get to know their students really well and might be at the forefront of hearing about some of these concerns. Tomorrow I have another presentation with folks that work with the study abroad. So my hope is to be getting this to more and more departments as well. And because going back to, that idea of like, we want this to be like a cultural thing within the university, right? Responding to mental health needs and also empowering resilience. So we're working on it. Yeah.
These are good though.
Yeah.
Like,
Can you read that okay?
Yeah.
Okay,
I would prefer for it to be bigger. There's some.
It could be better. Working on that too.
If you had these, like in our department, like we'd be happy to pick them up and leave them.
So I will send an electronic copy, and then you can kind of print it out as needed. Yeah. What else? Yeah.
Do you still have walk-in hours?
So That's a good question. The question was if we still have walk-in hours. So our systems kind of switched a bit in the last couple of years. So we switched from a typical 50-minute intake first appointment to these initial assessment appointments I was talking about. They're a little bit shorter, kind of focused on figuring out what's going on for the student. By doing that, we were able to cut down the wait for that first appointment to now students should be able to schedule within 1 or 2 days because of these triages. If it's ever longer than that, it's usually because they're scheduling conflicts, that they're not able to make it work. And so we took away walk-in hours because now we're able to put eyes on students so much sooner. And then also for crisis situations, we always have 1 or 2 blocks a day set aside for student is in, risk of safety concerns, need to see somebody. So we also have that caveat too of like if they need more time with somebody and it's really a crisis situation, there's that too.
Because I've walked students over and then I was like, I think this is during their walk-in times, but then they're always seen anyway. And I guess that's because there's someone on staff who's waiting in a way.
Yeah. Yeah. And the nice thing about walking them over is then we have them there and we can do a little bit more assessment of sort of what they need. So it might not be that they get seen immediately, but that'll be because we go through our own kind of assessment of like, okay, can you come back in the afternoon? Are you going to be good until then? Can you schedule an appointment for a day later? Or no, we want to make sure you meet with somebody right now and we'll make it happen. Yeah.
Can you also provide a tip? It's for people who haven't had the experience of walking a student to the counseling center. Like the first time I did it, I was like, stammering over to the person who works at the desk, like, the student is here and they're like, they need to see someone. So, is there like
sure.
a code or something?
So tips for when you walk a student over, how you like manage that situation. So what I can tell you is just that a student is walking in with an appointment with somebody else walking them in, particularly adult walking them in. We already know. Yeah, like that something's up. You can just go up to the office administrator and say, this is a student I've been working with, I wanted to make sure that somebody saw them because they're going through something difficult or, we were feeling concerned about them. Something, you can keep it generic because we understand. And then we'll go through sort of an assessment, which we do whenever a student reaches out anyway, because even if they walked in without you there, we're doing some kind of triaging for, is this an emergency, kind of what's going on. So I know people are trickling out, so I want to kind of like give you all freedom to go about your days, and thank you again. And I'll hang out for a little bit if anybody kind of wants to come up and ask me anything. So thanks again.